The first Tuesday of November came in cold and indifferent, the way November always comes to Harlan County. Kentucky, gray sky pressed low against the ridge, coal dust and wood smoke threading through the damp air like something the town breathes out and breathes back in again on an endless loop. The kind of morning that doesn't promise anything. It just arrives. The parking lot of Caldwell's Sporting Goods and Firearms sat 3/4 empty at 10 past 10. A cracked asphalt square boxed in by rusted chain link and a hand-painted sign that had been weathering since 1987, when Gene Caldwell opened the doors with $12,000, a lease agreement, and the reasonable conviction that people in Harlan County would always need ammunition. He was right about that. He was right about most things, until the stroke took him 3 years ago, and his son Philip inherited the keys and the register tape and the 12 years of debt Gene had run up, keeping the place open through the lean decades. Owen Driscoll pushed through the front door at 10:12 with his 7-year-old daughter Emma pressed against his left leg, her small hand threaded through his belt loop, the way she always walked, in unfamiliar places, not from fear. Exactly, but from a particular kind of attention. The way a person new to a room keeps themselves tethered to something known while they take the measure of everything else. Owen was 34. Carhartt jacket with a fraying cuff on the left sleeve he kept meaning to fix. Work boots with dried creek mud on the left heel from Thursday's job. The particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have learned to conserve energy the way other people conserve money. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, every gesture exactly as large as it needs to be. He needed a cleaning kit for the 22 his father had left him. Simple errand. 20 minutes, maybe. He had no idea. Pushing through that door with Emma's hand on his belt and the bell above the door announcing their arrival with its flat aluminum clatter, that the morning was about to become something he would describe to his daughter 14 years later, on a different morning, in a different room. When she was old enough for the full version, 3 men stood at the main counter. They had already formed their opinion. Owen would find that out in the next 8 minutes. And then the door behind the counter opened. Owen had learned to time his errands the way a careful man learns to read weather. Not with certainty, but with enough accumulated experience to make reasonable predictions. Weekday mornings were safer than afternoons. Tuesdays were quieter than Saturdays. Anywhere that required patience anywhere, he'd have to stand still long enough for a stranger to form a picture of him he tried to reach early, when the day was still uncrowded and people hadn't yet accumulated the small irritations that made them sharper than they needed to be. The complication was Emma. She had a half day. Teacher professional development, the note said, sent home the previous Friday in the folder she always handed him at the door of the school with the gravity of someone delivering official correspondence. He'd taken the morning jobs he could rearrange and kept the afternoon ones, which meant she was with him from noon onward. And the cleaning kit errand, which he'd been putting off for 2 weeks because the rifle sat in its soft case under the bed and wasn't hurting anyone, got folded into the afternoon's itinerary. She'd been trailing behind him since 12:15, asking questions about everything she passed. She asked, in the parking lot of the grocery store, why shopping carts always wanted to drift left. She asked, at the intersection of Route 9 and Miners Road, whether the traffic light had a brain or just a timer and whether there was a difference. She asked, while he buckled her into the back seat outside Caldwell's, whether guns were heavier than they looked in movies. Depends on the gun, Owen said. How much does Grandpa's weigh? About 5.5 pounds. She processed this. That's the same as my backpack with all my books. About that? Huh, she said, in the tone she used when a fact had connected to something she hadn't expected. He shut her door and stood for a moment in the parking lot, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the front of the store. He'd been in Caldwell's twice before, once 6 years ago, when he'd first moved back to Harlan County and needed to register his sidearm, and once, 3 years ago, when his father was still in the hospital and he'd come to buy ammunition for the rifle, thinking he'd take it to the range when his dad got out. His father had not gotten out. The ammunition sat in a box on the shelf in the hall closet. He pulled Emma's door back open, and they went in. Caldwell smelled exactly the way he remembered. gun oil and old carpet and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke that had been absorbed into the drywall sometime in the 90s and never fully left. Display cases ran along 3 walls, long guns racked behind glass on the back wall. A mounted whitetail buck over the door watched everything with the patient, glassy attention of something that had given up on being surprised. There were 3 men at the main counter. Owen steered Emma toward the accessory aisle without making eye contact and started looking for cleaning kits. Their names, as Owen would learn later, were Wade Ferris, Doug Steck, and Cody Marsh. Wade Ferris was 48. He worked dispatch for the county sheriff's department, which gave him a professional familiarity with firearms and a personal certainty that this familiarity constituted expertise. He had been coming to Caldwell's for 20 years, since before Gene Caldwell's stroke, since before the renovation that had moved the handguns to the east wall. He knew which floorboard near the ammunition display made a sound like a starter pistol if you stepped on it right, and he took a quiet satisfaction in knowing this, the way people take quiet satisfaction in small pieces of local knowledge that mark them as belonging somewhere. Doug Steck was 52 and ran a pressure washing business out of a white Ford pickup with a machine in the bed and his phone number on the door in stick-on letters, 2 of which had fallen off and not been replaced. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent most of his adult life in a county where everyone eventually knew everyone else, which had given him the comfortable assumption that strangers were a temporary condition, that they were passing through, that the categories he applied to them were provisional and would be corrected as more information arrived. The problem was that the information often didn't arrive, and he continued operating on the categories. Cody Marsh was 25. New to Harlan County by way of Lexington, where he'd spent 3 years working at a sporting goods chain before the store closed, and he came back to the county where his mother's people were from. He'd been in Caldwell 6-7 times. He was still in the process of establishing himself as someone who belonged there, which meant he was slightly more aggressive about performing belonging than the men who had already established it. The 3 of them were mid-conversation when Owen and Emma came in something about the new suppressor regulations, something about bore diameter, something that required a vocabulary dense enough to signal that the people using it knew what they were talking about. Owen caught fragments as he moved down the accessory aisle and crouched to read labels on cleaning kits. He found the right one. A Remington-branded kit with the appropriate bore brushes and patches. He crouched there for a moment, reading the back of the package, making sure, and Emma stood behind him with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching the room with the focused attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. She said, very quietly, "That man is watching us." Owen didn't turn around. "Which one?" "The one with the hat, the young one." He stood up, walked to the counter, set the cleaning kit on the glass, waited. Nobody moved to ring him up. The conversation at the counter continued at the same volume, the same pace, the same deliberate density. Doug Steck glanced at him once and looked away. Wade Ferris didn't glance at all. His version of acknowledgement was a minimal shift in posture that could be read as either "I see you" or "I've decided not to see you," depending on the circumstances. Owen put his hands in his pockets and stood there. He was good at this, at standing still in rooms while being assessed. He'd had a lot of practice. Emma came to stand beside him. She was studying the handguns in the case below the register with the methodical attention she brought to anything she considered worth understanding. She moved her gaze along the row of them the way she moved her gaze along the spines of books in the library, looking for something, though she couldn't have said what. "Help you." Wade Ferris said it like a period at the end of a sentence. "Not a question. A concession." "Cleaning kit," Owen said. "Remington 597. I've got the one I need, just need to pay for it." Ferris looked at the kit on the counter. He looked at Owen. "You know what you're buying?" he said. There was a pause. Not a long one, a second, maybe 2. Just long enough for the question to settle into the room and for everyone to understand what kind of question it actually was. "Cleaning kit," Owen said. "For a 22. Cody Marsh laughed. Not at the exchange, or not only at it. The laugh had the quality of something that had been waiting for an occasion and had found one. Doug Steck said, "You shoot much?" Not unkindly, Doug Steck was not a man who thought of himself as unkind, but with the particular tone of someone who has already concluded that the answer will confirm what he suspects. "Some." "What do you run?" "Remington 597. My dad's rifle." Wade Ferris made a sound. Low, brief, the kind of sound that doesn't commit to anything specific but communicates clearly. 597's a decent enough rimfire, he said. Action's a little sloppy out of the box. "It's my dad's," Owen said. "I'm keeping it the way it is." Cody Marsh said, to the middle distance, not to anyone in particular but at a volume calibrated for everyone to hear. "Bet he shoots it at Christmas." If that. Owen looked at the surface of the counter. The glass was smudged in the upper left corner where people rested their palms. He looked at it the way you look at something that has nothing to do with anything, which is to say, carefully, because you need somewhere to put your attention that isn't the place where putting it would cost you something. Emma had stopped studying the display case. She was looking up at her father with an expression Owen knew well. Chin slightly elevated, jaw set at the particular angle that was her version of his version of patience, which was to say, not the absence of feeling but the management of it. He put his hand on her shoulder. She let him. Cody Marsh said, "You even know what caliber you're cleaning? Long rifle or short?" This was addressed to Owen directly. Owen turned and looked at him. He did it without hurry. The way you turn when you've decided to address something, rather than let it pass. Not reactive, not confrontational, just clear, he said. 22 long rifle. Rimfire cartridge. Same as I said when I walked up. Yeah, but do you know the difference between... Cody. The voice came from the back hallway, through the door behind the register. Single word, same volume as everything else in the room, but it landed differently. Everything in the room stopped. What the men at the counter of Caldwell's Sporting Goods and Firearms did not know about Owen Driscoll could have filled a personnel file 4 inches thick and classified in 3 places. They did not know that he had enlisted at 19, the same week his mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, because the Army enlistment bonus was $12,000, and that was the single largest sum of money he had ever been in the vicinity of. He'd signed the paperwork on a Thursday. He'd been on a bus to Fort Jackson by Monday morning. They did not know that he'd completed basic with scores that got him flagged, not in the way that gets a soldier pulled aside for problems, but in the way that gets a soldier pulled aside for options. Options he hadn't known were options. Options that led, eventually, to a 14-month assignment at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he taught marksmanship to other soldiers. The mechanics of it, the patience of it, the way breath and heartbeat and muscle memory converge at the exact moment when a round leaves a barrel, and everything that happens afterward is just physics doing what physics does. They did not know about the 2 tours in Iraq, or the one in Afghanistan, or the specific character of each, the way the first tour had the quality of something you can still be surprised by, and the second had the quality of confirmation, and the third had a different quality entirely, which was the quality of understanding that you are no longer someone who gets surprised, and that this is both a useful thing and a costly one. They did not know that he'd come home from his final deployment to marry a woman named Carla Vance, whom he'd met at a friend's wedding in Cincinnati and written letters to for 8 months, the old-fashioned kind that came in envelopes and took 5 days to cross the distance. They did not know that the marriage had been good for 4 years, genuinely good, not the kind people say was good because they don't want to examine it, and then had become something Carla couldn't sustain. Not because she was weak, but because she was honest, and she was honest enough to understand that the life she wanted and the life she was building had diverged enough that staying would damage both of them worse than leaving. They did not know about the custody arrangement, which Carla had negotiated with the directness that characterized everything she did. She signed over primary custody because she knew, with the same honesty that had ended the marriage, that Owen was the better parent for Emma. She saw her daughter every other weekend and every other holiday, and she called every evening at 7. And she was, in her way, still present, just in the configuration that made the most sense. They did not know that Owen had rebuilt his entire life around a 7-year-old girl's schedule. 3:15 pickup. Every day. Not sometimes. Every day. He'd turned down 2 jobs that didn't accommodate 3:15. He'd rearranged his sleep schedule so that the early morning hours, 4 to 7, when the house was quiet and Emma was still in her bedroom with her drawings and her books, were for the things he needed to do before the day began in earnest. He'd built a routine so reliable that Emma, who had an engineer's relationship with predictability, had once told her second-grade teacher that her dad was very organized, which was not wrong but also didn't quite capture it. The men at the counter saw a man in a worn jacket with a kid attached to his belt loop. They made their assessments. Owen had been in rooms like this before. He would be in rooms like this again. He had, a long time ago, stopped carrying the weight of other people's assessments of him, not because he didn't notice them, but because he'd done the arithmetic and found that the cost of carrying that weight outweighed any benefit it produced. You put it down. You kept walking. You picked up what mattered and left what didn't. He stood at the counter and looked at the smudge on the glass. He waited. The younger man, Cody Marsh, had a quality Owen recognized the same way you recognize a type of weather. You've seen it enough times that the signs don't require conscious interpretation, they just register. The confidence of someone who'd never been in a room where what he knew turned out to be insufficient. Not stupidity, Cody Marsh wasn't stupid. Something more like inexperience, wearing the costume of certainty, which is common enough at 25 that it practically has its own category. He'd been watching Owen since the bell above the door had announced their entry. Not openly, he was practiced enough for that, but in the sidelong way of someone who's running a continuous background assessment, the way an animal tracks movement at the edge of its territory without fully orienting toward it. He'd reached his conclusions quickly. Single dad, obviously the kid on the belt loop, the worn jacket, the errand happening at 10 on a Tuesday when the kid should be in school. Inherited rifle, clearly nobody buys a 597 inches this decade by choice. They get them from fathers or uncles. Doesn't shoot, almost certainly the uncertainty at the counter. The reaching for the cleaning kit, like he'd had to look for it. The conclusions weren't entirely wrong in their components. They were wrong in their totality. But Cody Marsh didn't know that, and he was young enough to confuse component accuracy with composite accuracy, which is a common and expensive mistake. He said, to Wade and Doug, but at a volume that required no special effort to hear from 3 feet away. Single dad, probably, you can always tell. Owen kept his eyes forward. They come in, don't know exactly what they want, kid trailing behind. Gun was handed down. My guess is it hasn't been fired in a year. Doug Steck had the baseline decency to look at the wall. Wade Ferris said nothing, which, in this context, functioned as agreement. Emma, standing beside Owen, had gone very still in the particular way she went still when she was processing something that upset her. Not the stillness of retreat, but the stillness of attention, of gathering. Owen looked down at her. She looked up at him. Her jaw was at the angle. Her eyes said, "I'm watching this. I'm putting this somewhere." He said, very quietly, "It's okay." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and looked back at the counter with the expression of someone who has accepted a description of reality without accepting that reality as acceptable. She was 7. She had her father's patience and her mother's honesty, and she was, already, a more precise instrument for reading rooms than most adults Owen knew. Cody Marsh said, "You even know what caliber you're cleaning, long rifle or short?" Owen turned and looked at him. He said, "22 long rifle, rimfire. Same as I said 2 minutes ago when I walked up." "Yeah, but do you understand why the cleaning process is different depending on..." The voice from the back hallway. "Cody, one word. Quiet. Final in the way that one-word commands from certain people are final, not because of volume, but because of weight." Cody stopped mid-sentence. Philip Caldwell was 51 years old and had been working in this store. in one capacity or another, since he was 9. He remembered being 9 in this store. He remembered stocking shelves, while his father Gene explained. In the patient way, Gene explained everything. That a business is not just a thing you run, it's a thing you are responsible for, which is different. Responsibility, Gene Caldwell had said, is just weight you've chosen to carry instead of weight that happened to you. One of them you can put down, the other one you can't. Philip had put the store down for 14 years. Marine Corps. Fallujah in 2004, which was the kind of noun that didn't need an adjective if you'd been there. A decade of other deployments, other theaters, other configurations of the same essential fact that organized his service. That some things require a person to stand between them and something worse, and that being that person requires you to become a particular kind of person, and that you don't become that kind of person and then stop being it just because the assignment changes. He'd come back to Harlan County at 40. His father had been diagnosed. He'd driven from Camp Lejeune to Harlan in 11 hours without stopping and walked into the hospital room, and his father had looked at him the particular way his father had always looked at him. With that complete, undemanding attention, and said, "The keys are in my jacket." He'd taken the keys. He'd run the store for 11 years now, and he was a different proprietor than his father in some ways and identical in the ones that mattered. Gene Caldwell had run the store on the principle that people deserved to be treated according to what they actually were, not what they appeared to be, and that the work of a good proprietor was largely the work of paying close enough attention to know the difference. Philip had inherited the principle along with the register and the lease and the 12-year debt. He'd been in the back doing inventory when he heard the exchange at the counter. He heard Wade Ferris's question. He heard Cody Marsh's commentary. He heard Owen Driscoll's voice, flat, even, giving back exactly what had been asked and nothing more. He recognized that voice. Not the specific voice, he'd never met Owen Driscoll, but the quality of it, the particular economy of it, the absence of defensiveness in it, which was not the same as the absence of awareness. He'd heard that quality in his own voice, when he thought about it. He'd heard it in the voices of other men who had been in certain rooms and come out of them carrying the knowledge that not every room was worth the full expenditure. He came through the door behind the counter. He looked at the man at the register. He did not look at the jacket or the boots or the cleaning kit on the glass. He looked at the man. The way he was standing, slightly turned, so that his left shoulder angled toward the door. The way his weight was distributed, not leaning, not braced, just present in the particular way that means a person has learned to be ready without advertising it. The way his hand rested on the girl's shoulder, not gripping, not performing reassurance, just there. There is a way that people who have served recognize each other that has nothing to do with haircuts or posture, or the vocabulary they use when they talk about weapons. It's something harder to name and easier to feel. A quality of attentiveness that has been shaped by circumstance into something specific, the way a river shapes a stone, not by intent but by sustained contact over time. Philip Caldwell had spent 14 years becoming a particular kind of person. He knew what it looked like from the outside because he'd seen it in mirrors and in other men and in the occasional photograph that caught it in the expression rather than the uniform. He looked at Owen Driscoll and he said, "Sir," not as a formula, not as retail courtesy, as a word with its full meaning intact, offered to a specific person for a specific reason. The room changed. It didn't change loudly. It changed the way rooms change when the gravity shifts, when the person who constitutes the authority in a space makes a gesture that reorients everything else around it. Wade Ferris's posture altered slightly. Doug Steck developed a sudden interest in the display case across the room. Cody Marsh went still. Philip walked to the register. He looked at the cleaning kit. "Remington 597, he said. "Yeah," Owen said. "Good kit for that. Though if you want better performance on the barrel, we just got in a new stock of Hoppy's Nobert 9. It's worth the extra step on rimfire." "I'll take it," Owen said. Philip turned to get the solvent from the shelf behind the counter. As he passed Cody Marsh, he said, without breaking stride, without modulating his voice in any special way. Pull the Browning inventory. All of it. The back room, the shelf above the loading press. Right now. Cody went. He went immediately and without argument, which told Philip something. The boy was educable. That mattered more than he knew. Wade Ferris found something to examine in the far display case. Doug Steck's phone became suddenly essential. Philip set the bore solvent on the counter next to the cleaning kit. He opened the register. Emma Driscoll had watched all of it. She had watched Cody Marsh say the things he said. She had watched her father stand at the counter with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set and his eyes on the smudge in the glass. She had watched the three men arrange themselves in the room the way people arrange themselves when they've decided, collectively, to be a particular kind of room to be in. And then she had watched the door open. And she had watched the man who came through it look at her father, the way she had seen very few people look at her father. Not through him, not past him, not with the particular quality of attention that is actually assessment in disguise. But at him, with recognition. She was 7 years old. She was, as her second-grade teacher had noted in a parent conference Owen still thought about sometimes, unusually attentive to relational dynamics, which was a way of saying that Emma noticed things. She noticed when people meant what they said and when they were saying something other than what they meant. She noticed when a room was genuinely warm and when it was performing warmth. She noticed when her father was holding something and when he wasn't. She looked up at Philip Caldwell. She said, "Why did you call my dad sir?" Owen said, "Emma." The tone that meant, "That's a question for later." But Philip Caldwell looked at her with the direct attention of someone who believes that children deserve straight answers and that giving them anything else is a form of disrespect. He said, "Because he earned it." Emma considered this with the full weight of her attention. "How do you know he earned it?" "Because I've met people who have." You get to where you can tell. She thought about that for a moment, turning it over. Then she said, "Like how Daddy knows it's going to rain, even when the weather app says clear skies. Because he can feel things the app can't." Philip Caldwell looked at Owen. Owen was looking at the counter again. His expression had the quality of a man who has spent a long time being unseen and is unexpectedly, briefly, visible. It was not an entirely comfortable expression. It was the expression of someone in the process of receiving something they hadn't asked for, but that turned out to be exactly what they needed. Philip said, "Yeah, exactly like that." Emma seemed satisfied. She went back to examining the display case with renewed interest, as if the conversation had given her permission to engage with the room more fully. She said, to no one in particular, "This one's a 9mm, right? The one in the middle." Philip looked at the case. "It is. I know because Daddy showed me the bullet once. He has some in a box in the hall closet. He said they're from a different time." Owen said, "Emma?" Philip smiled. Not broadly, just at the corners, the smile of a man who doesn't distribute smiles carelessly. "Smart kid," he said. "She asks a lot of questions," Owen said. "Good," Philip said. "World needs more of that." He rang up the cleaning kit and the solvent while Emma examined a rack of hunting calls near the end of the counter with the intensity of someone conducting field research. She picked up a crow call and looked at it from multiple angles before setting it back down. Philip said, in the register's particular quiet, "How long were you in?" 9 years. Army? 11th Infantry. Finished at Benning as a marksmanship instructor. Philip nodded slowly. He did not ask about tours. The people who wanted to talk about tours brought them up themselves, and the people who didn't had their reasons, and either way, asking felt like opening a door you hadn't been invited to open. He said, "You get back to Harlan long ago?" 7 years. "After my dad's stroke." A pause. "He was in this store once, came in for a scope, I think. Gene Caldwell helped him." Philip looked up from the register. "What was his name?" "Robert Driscoll. Went by Bob." Philip thought for a moment. Then, Bob Driscoll. He had that old International Harvester. Red, kept it running about 20 years past when it should have stopped. Something shifted in Owen's expression. Not dramatically, just a degree or two, the way light changes when a cloud moves. "Yeah," he said. "That's him. I remember him," Philip said. "Good man. Didn't talk much, but when he did it was worth listening to." Owen nodded. He took the receipt Philip was holding across the counter. Philip held it a half-second longer than necessary, not dramatically, just the natural hesitation of a man deciding whether to say the next thing. He said, "My dad handed me this store when he got sick. Just handed it over. 11 years ago. I'd been gone 14 years and I walked back in and he handed me the keys like I'd just stepped out for lunch." He paused. "There's no blueprint for coming back. You figure it out as you go. Most days, you're okay. Some days, you're not. You figure those out too." Owen held the receipt. He said, "Yeah, not much of a word. But it carried what it needed to carry, and Philip Caldwell heard it the way it was meant. Some days," Philip said. Two men who had been in certain rooms, standing at a counter in Harlan County, Kentucky, not saying very much, saying everything. In the back room, pulling Browning inventory off a metal shelf onto a cart, Cody Marsh worked in silence and listened. The voices from the front of the store came through the partial wall clearly enough. Not all of it. The register conversation was too quiet, the voices too controlled. But the parts that carried. 9 years. Army, marksmanship instructor. The name, Bob Driscoll and Philip Caldwell, saying, "I remember him, good man." Cody Marsh was 25. He had been in Harlan County for 8 months, and before that he'd been in Lexington, and before that he'd grown up in a small town in the eastern part of the state where hunting was so embedded in the culture that the middle school had a shooting team. He knew firearms the way a person raised in a specific tradition knows it thoroughly within the tradition, limited outside it. He had not been anywhere, in the sense of having been in the places that shape certain people. He knew this in an abstract way. He was beginning, in the back room of Caldwell's on a Tuesday in November, to know it in a more specific way. He finished the inventory. He stood in the back room for a few extra minutes that the task didn't require. He was going over what he'd said at the counter, not the specific words. He remembered those clearly enough. They were already becoming the kind of thing you remember in the dark at 2 in the morning, but the disposition behind them, the certainty he'd felt, the ease of it, the way he'd said it to Wade and Doug but loud enough, the way that kind of thing is always done, deniably loud, coverably audible. He'd been performing. He understood that now. Performing belonging, performing expertise, performing the casual confidence of someone established in a room. And the man he'd been performing at had been standing there in a worn jacket with mud on his boot and had said nothing, nothing that rose to the occasion, nothing that pointed to the performance, just answered the question asked and waited for the next thing. Cody came back to the front of the store. Owen and Emma were still at the register. Emma was explaining something to Philip about hunting calls, specifically that the crow call he stalked was more realistic than the mallard, which was a bold claim she was defending with what sounded like genuine ornithological reasoning. Cody set the clipboard on the counter. He didn't look at Wade or Doug. He looked at Owen. He said, "I'm sorry for what I said before. The commentary, all of it, it wasn't right." He said it straight, without qualification, without the softening that turns apologies into negotiations. He'd decided, in the back room, that if he was going to do it, he was going to do it properly. Owen looked at him for a moment, the same assessment he'd been giving the room all morning, careful and unhurried. He said, "Okay," not warmly, not coldly, just, "Okay." The acknowledgement of a man who did not need the apology to feel vindicated, who had not been waiting for it, who was not going to dress it up into something it wasn't. Cody nodded. He picked up the clipboard and went back to work. It was, in its way, the right ending to what he'd started. Emma carried the bag. She always carried the bag on errands. She'd established this rule at age 5 and maintained it with the consistency of someone who understood that rituals are how you hold the shape of a day. The bag was slightly too large for her, and she managed it with both hands, which meant she walked close to Owen's left side instead of holding his belt loop. At the door, Philip Caldwell said, "Come back when you want to work on that action. I've got a trigger group that'll tighten up the 597 considerably without changing the character of the rifle." Owen stopped at the door. He turned back. He said, "It was my dad's. I'm not looking to change too much of it." Philip understood that instantly, not as sentiment, but as something more precise and harder to articulate. The particular relationship between a person and an inherited object that has to do not with the object's function, but with its continuity, with the fact that it was his father's hands on it before his hands, and his father's care, and his father's patience at the cleaning kit on Tuesday evenings when the work week was done. "Fair," he said. "Then come back when you need the solvent." Owen held the door for Emma. She walked through and then stopped, turned with the precision of someone executing a planned maneuver, and said to Philip Caldwell with great seriousness, "The crow call is more realistic than the mallard call, in case that matters for your inventory decisions." Philip said, "I appreciate the consultation." Emma nodded once, satisfied, the nod of a person whose input has been received appropriately. She walked out. Owen followed her. The bell above the door made its flat aluminum sound. November light, the particular flat white of late morning in the mountains, sat over the cracked asphalt and the rusted fence and the hand-painted sign. Emma walked beside Owen with the bag gripped in both hands, adjusting her hold every few steps. She said, "That man was good." Owen looked at her. "Yeah, the other ones weren't." "No. Why?" He thought about how to answer, not how to soften it. Emma had a precise instrument for detecting softening, and she filed it away as dishonesty, which she found more troubling than the honest version of whatever she was being protected from. But how to be accurate? How to give her the right word for the right thing? He said, "Sometimes people decide what they think about someone before they know anything about that person. Then they act based on what they decided. It's easier than paying attention." "That's dumb," Emma said. "It's human," Owen said, "which isn't the same thing, but they overlap." She considered this with the expression she wore when she was adding something to an internal ledger she kept on "how things work." Then, "Did it bother you?" "A little. But you didn't say anything." "No." "Why not?" They reached the truck. He unlocked it. She handed him the bag with the relief of someone who has carried something a respectable distance and is done. He put the bag in the passenger seat, and she climbed into the back and began buckling herself in with the focused efficiency she brought to mechanical tasks. He said, from outside the door, "Because some things fix themselves, some things don't, and spending energy on the ones that won't is just spending it on nothing." Emma clicked the buckle. She said, "The young one fixed himself." Owen got in the front seat. "He did. Do you think he meant the apology?" Owen started the truck. The engine caught on the first turn. He said, "I think he surprised himself. When people get surprised the right way, what they say right after tends to be real." And Emelina looked out the window as he backed out of the space. She watched the storefront recede, the weathered sign, the flag above the door, the mounted deer visible in the window. She said, after a moment, "Daddy, yeah, you never told me about Fort Benning." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. He said, "You never asked. I'm asking now." He turned onto Route 9. The mountains sat gray and patient at the edges of the sky, the way they always sat, the way they would be sitting long after everything else had changed. He said, "It's a long story." Emma said, "We don't have to be home until 3. Owen drove. He drove for a few seconds in the comfortable silence that was their silence, the specific silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to be quiet without it meaning anything other than that they are comfortable. Then he started talking. Philip Caldwell went back to his inventory. He did not make a speech. He did not gather Wade Ferris and Doug Steck for a conversation about what had just happened. He did not send anyone a message or post anything anywhere. He was not that kind of man, and this was not that kind of story, and he understood the difference between things that require formal acknowledgement and things that are better addressed by simply doing the right thing while it's still in front of you. He finished counting the Browning stock. He noted that they were low on the rimfire ammunition Jean had always kept stocked in volume. He straightened a display of gun cases that had been listing slightly to the left since someone had brushed against it on Saturday. Wade Ferris left without saying much. Doug Steck said, "See you Thursday," with the tone of a man aware that the morning had not reflected particularly well on him, and uncertain how to address that without addressing it. Cody Marsh worked until 5 without being asked to. He did it without comment, without calling attention to it, without the performance of making up for something. He just worked. Philip noted this the way he noted most things, quietly, without immediate response, in the running account he kept of how people conducted themselves when they thought it wasn't being particularly observed. At 4:30, Cody said, "How did you know?" "Just from looking at him." Philip was reloading a display case. He didn't stop. He said, "You look at enough people, you start to see the ones who've carried things. Not what they carried, you don't necessarily know that, just that they've carried it. It leaves a quality. Same way, a fence post that's been under pressure for a long time looks different from one that hasn't." Cody thought about that. "I didn't see any of that." "No," Philip said. "You weren't looking for it. You were looking for something else." He said it without cruelty, as a statement about optics, about what you see when you're looking for confirmation of what you already think versus looking at what's actually there. Cody was quiet for a while. Then, "What do I look for?" "When I'm trying to see it." Philip considered this. He closed the display case. He turned around. He said, "Stop looking for what category a person fits. Just look at how they're standing, how they're holding their attention, what they do when the room is treating them badly." He paused. "A person who's been through something and come out of it, they don't need the room to behave. They've already accounted for the possibility that it won't." Cody was quiet for a long time after that. Outside, November was doing what November does in the mountains, going dark early, without ceremony, the light just leaving, the way things leave when they're not going to be there anymore and haven't decided to make an event of it. Owen got home at 12:50. He made Emma a grilled cheese because it was Tuesday and Tuesdays were grilled cheese days, a rule she'd established at age 5 and enforced ever since, with the consistency of someone who understood that the predictable structures of a day are not constraints but architecture, the things that hold the shape of your time so that the unpredictable parts have something to push against. He cleaned the rifle at the kitchen table while she ate and talked about her half-day. Something about a project on migratory patterns. Something about which window in the school had the best view of the field where geese landed in October before they kept going south. She ate the grilled cheese in quadrants, the way she always did. He worked the cleaning kit methodically, the way his father had taught him and the Army had refined. Barrel from breech to muzzle, contact surfaces, action, each component in order. The new Hoppy's solvent was better than what he'd been using. Philip Caldwell had been right about that. Emma watched him work between bites. She said, "Is it always the same order?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because a rifle is a tool and tools work reliably when they're maintained reliably. Same process every time means nothing gets missed." She thought about this. "Like how you make my lunch the same way every morning." "Pretty much." "Ritual," she said, with the careful precision of someone deploying a recently acquired vocabulary word and making sure it fits. "Ritual," he agreed. She finished the last quadrant. He finished with the barrel, moved to the bolt, worked through the rest of the sequence. The rifle went back together the way it always did, each component settling into its place with the quiet, specific sound of parts that fit because someone has maintained them, that have been fitted and refitted enough times that the fit is now a kind of conversation between the metal and the person holding it. He held it for a moment before setting it down. His father had bought this rifle in 1991. He'd shot it once a month for 22 years, until the arthritis in his right hand made the bolt action impractical. He'd kept it in the soft case under the bed and cleaned it every season whether it needed it or not, which Owen now understood was not about the rifle. It was about the doing of a thing, the continuity of doing it. The fact that some things are worth maintaining even when you're not currently using them. Owen put the rifle in the case. He washed his hands at the sink and stood at the kitchen window for a moment. Looking out at the yard and the tree line and the mountains beyond, which were losing their definition now in the gray afternoon, going soft at the edges the way they do when the light goes sideways, he thought about Fort Benning. He'd told Emma about it on the drive home. Not everything, but enough. The base, the range. Georgia in August, the heat something you moved through rather than in. The particular satisfaction of teaching someone to do something precisely, watching them find it, watching the groups tighten and the understanding arrive in the expression before it arrived anywhere else. She'd listened without interrupting. At the end, she'd said, "You were good at it?" He'd said, "I was okay." She'd said, "You say you're okay at things you're actually good at. I noticed that." He hadn't answered. She'd looked out the window and said, "I'm just telling you, in case it's useful." He stood at the kitchen window. Emma had moved to the living room with her colored pencils, doing something that required the full extent of her concentration, which meant she was quiet and would be quiet for a while, which was its own kind of gift on an afternoon that had been more than it was supposed to be. He dried his hands. He went and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the cleaning kit and the solvent and the rifle case, all of it spread on the table in the way of things that have been used and cared for and put away. Some mornings start as nothing, a cleaning kit, an errand, a half day, so the kid comes along. You push through a door with her hand on your belt loop and 3 men at the counter decide in 30 seconds what kind of man you are. You've been in rooms like that. You'll be in rooms like that again. You've learned the arithmetic. The cost of reacting is almost always higher than the cost of waiting. So you wait, and sometimes the door behind the counter opens, and sometimes the man who comes through it has been in the same kinds of rooms you've been in, has carried the same kinds of things, has done the same arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusions. He doesn't announce this. He doesn't need to. He says, "Sir," in the way that word means when it means something. And the room changes, and you are, briefly, unexpectedly, visible. It's not vindication. You weren't waiting for vindication. It's something smaller and more necessary than that, just the acknowledgement that there is more to you than what the room decided, and that someone with the equipment to see it, sees it. And your daughter watches all of it. She watches the room decide. She watches you hold still. She watches the door open and the room change and the man say the word. She's 7. She's taking notes she doesn't know she's taking. In the language she'll spend the next 20 years learning to read. She'll remember this room. She'll remember the counter and the glass and the 3 men and the door and the man who came through it. She'll remember what you did when the room treated you badly, and what it cost and what it didn't cost. You drive home. You make a grilled cheese. You clean the rifle your father left you with the solvent the man at the store recommended, which turns out to be exactly right. You hold the rifle for a moment before you put it away, feeling the weight of it, which is the same weight as her backpack with all her books. The mountains don't change. November doesn't apologize. Some days start as nothing and turn into the ones you carry for years, not because anything dramatic happened, but because something true happened, quiet and unhurried, in a room with bad lighting and a mounted deer over the door. And you come home to your daughter and she asks questions you try to answer honestly because she'll notice if you don't. That's enough. Most days, that's enough.